Lieutenant Commander Wade Alvarez had seen his share of bad days, but this one was shaping up to be a real winner. The kind of day that started with routine supply runs and ended with, well, judging by the way his transport was currently nose-deep in a snowbank, while hurricane-force winds tried to turn him into a human popsicle, it wasn't looking like a happy ending kind of day. "Outstanding," he muttered, wrestling with the emergency beacon that had decided this was the perfect moment to malfunction. Because of course it had. When you're stranded on Arcturus Prime, a planet so hostile it makes Antarctica look like a tropical vacation, your emergency equipment naturally chooses that exact moment to throw in the towel. The blizzard outside wasn't just any storm. This was the kind of weather that meteorologists probably had nightmares about, the kind that turned grown men into ice sculptures in under 10 minutes. The wind was howling like a pack of banshees who'd been told the apocalypse was running late. And the temperature? Well, let's just say Wade's suit readout was showing numbers that would make penguins file for relocation. Wade had always prided himself on being prepared for anything. 20 years as a disaster relief engineer before joining the Colonial Defense Force had taught him that Murphy's Law wasn't just a saying, it was practically a universal constant. If something could go wrong, it would. Usually at the worst possible moment. Usually when you were alone, freezing, and running low on both patience and power cells. But right now, as he stared at his crashed transport and tried to calculate how long his suit's heating system would last in -80 degrees weather, Wade found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally met a situation that was beyond even his considerable problem-solving skills. The transport's hull was cracked like an eggshell, and the heating system was making those ominous clicking sounds that engineering equipment made right before it decided to quit permanently. His radio was dead, his beacon was having some sort of electronic nervous breakdown, and according to his suit's computer, the nearest colonial outpost was roughly 200 kilometers away through terrain that could generously be described as actively trying to kill you. "Well, Wade," he said to himself, because talking to yourself was still technically conversation when you were the only living thing for hundreds of kilometers. This is what they call a character-building experience. The wind outside answered with a particularly vicious gust that made his partially buried transport groan ominously. Wade took that as his cue to start moving. Standing around feeling sorry for himself wasn't going to generate body heat, and body heat was currently his most precious resource. He grabbed his emergency pack, checked his weapon, because Arcturus Prime had wildlife that considered humans a delicacy, and prepared to venture into what could only be described as nature's attempt at creating the perfect human elimination machine. The moment he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a physical blow. Even through his insulated suit, the wind cut through him with surgical precision. The snow wasn't falling so much as being hurled horizontally by winds that seemed personally offended by his existence. Wade had survived disaster zones, combat deployments, and 3 different types of food poisoning courtesy of military rations. But Arcturus Prime's weather wasn't just trying to kill him. It was trying to do it efficiently, professionally, and with what he could swear was a sense of personal satisfaction. He oriented himself using his suit's navigation system and started trudging through snow that came up to his knees. Every step was a battle against wind that wanted to knock him down and cold that wanted to freeze him solid. His breath fogged instantly in his helmet, and ice was already starting to form on his visor, despite the suit's heating elements. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Wade spotted something through the swirling snow. A structure. Not natural. The lines were too straight, the angles too precise. As he got closer, fighting against wind that seemed determined to push him back, the shape resolved into what looked like a research station. "About time something went right," Wade muttered, though he knew better than to trust good luck. In his experience, when things started going right after going spectacularly wrong, it usually meant the universe was just setting up for an even bigger punchline. The station looked abandoned, which on Arcturus Prime could mean anything from evacuated last week to evacuated last decade and picked clean by scavengers. But abandoned or not, it had walls, and walls meant protection from the wind that was currently trying to sandblast him with ice crystals. Wade reached the entrance, a standard colonial airlock system that looked like it had seen better years. The power indicator was dark, which meant either the station was completely dead or running on minimal backup power. He pulled out his emergency override tool, a device that was technically for emergency situations, but had somehow become standard equipment for anyone who'd ever had to deal with colonial bureaucracy. The airlock cycled with a wheeze that suggested the machinery was about as happy to be working as Wade was to be using it. But it worked, and right now, functional was the only standard that mattered. The inner door opened to reveal a corridor lit by the dim glow of emergency lighting. The air was cold, not suit your heating system, just died cold, but definitely not what anyone would call comfortable. Wade's breath still misted, but at least he wasn't being actively assaulted by meteorological phenomena. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing down the empty corridor. "Anyone home?" Colonial Defense Force, in case anyone's keeping track. Silence. The kind of complete, absolute silence that meant either the station was truly abandoned or its inhabitants were very, very good at hiding. Wade moved carefully down the corridor, his weapon ready but not raised. The station had the feel of a place that had been left in a hurry rather than properly shut down. Equipment was still in place, but personal items were gone. Desk drawers hung open, and there was that particular kind of disorder that came from people grabbing what they could carry and leaving everything else behind. He checked room after room, laboratories, quarters, storage areas, finding nothing but empty spaces and the lingering sense that something had gone very wrong here. The research equipment was top-of-the-line colonial tech, the kind of gear that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Nobody abandoned equipment like this unless they had no choice. It wasn't until he reached what looked like the main laboratory that Wade found them. 3 small forms huddled together in the corner of the room, so still they could have been sculptures. For a moment, Wade thought they were just that, some kind of alien art, or maybe research specimens preserved in stasis. But then his suit's thermal sensors picked up faint heat signatures, and he realized what he was looking at. They were alive. Barely, but alive. Wade approached slowly, not wanting to startle them. As he got closer, he could see they were definitely not human. Their skin had a crystalline quality that caught and reflected the dim emergency lighting, and their proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed designed for a different kind of gravity. But despite their alien features, there was something unmistakably young about them, something vulnerable. Cubs. That's what they were. Alien cubs, huddled together for warmth in an abandoned research station, while outside, the worst blizzard in recent memory tried to turn the entire planet into a glacier. Wade's suit computer was already analyzing the air and providing readouts on the local environment. The temperature in the lab was well below freezing and getting colder as the station's failing heating system lost its battle against Arcturus Prime's hostile climate. These cubs, whatever species they belonged to, were dying. Slowly, but inevitably. Unless someone did something about it. Wade stood there for a moment, staring down at the 3 small forms, and felt the universe deliver its punchline. Here he was, stranded on a planet that was actively trying to kill him, in a failing research station with no communications and dwindling power, looking at 3 alien cubs who would be dead within hours unless someone figured out how to keep them warm. The rational thing to do would be to take what supplies he could carry and try to make it to the nearest outpost. These weren't his responsibility. They weren't even his species. But Wade had spent 20 years pulling people out of disasters. And before that, he'd been the kind of kid who brought home stray dogs despite his parents' protests. Looking at those 3 small, vulnerable forms, he knew there was really only one choice he could make. The choice that was probably going to get him killed, but was somehow the only one that would let him live with himself. "Well," Wade said quietly, settling down his emergency pack, "looks like we're all in this together now." Outside, the blizzard howled its approval of the universe's latest joke. A human engineer, 3 dying alien cubs, and a research station that was falling apart in the middle of the worst weather system in the planet's recorded history. Wade looked around the laboratory, already mentally cataloging what he could use, what he could modify, and what he could jury-rig into something that might keep 4 living beings alive long enough for the storm to pass. It was going to take everything he had learned in 20 years of disaster relief, every trick he'd picked up in his military service, and probably a few miracles he hadn't earned yet. But then again, Wade had always been better at the impossible than the merely difficult. Wade had built emergency shelters out of airplane wreckage, constructed field hospitals from shipping containers, and once famously turned a collapsed parking garage into a functional rescue operation headquarters. But looking around the failing research station with 3 alien cubs slowly freezing to death, he was pretty sure this was going to be his masterpiece. Assuming, of course, that masterpieces were typically measured by how spectacularly they failed. The first order of business was assessment, and the assessment was not encouraging. The station's heating system was running on backup power that was draining faster than water through a sieve. His suit's environmental scanner showed the internal temperature dropping steadily, and outside, the blizzard was hitting the station with winds that made the building shake like a paint mixer. "Okay," Wade muttered, pulling out his multi-tool and starting to take readings on everything electronic in sight. "Let's see what we're working with here." What they were working with, it turned out, was a collection of expensive research equipment that was absolutely useless for keeping anyone warm, a power grid that was held together with hope and prayer, and 3 alien cubs whose biological needs he knew absolutely nothing about. The cubs themselves were fascinating in a way that would have been much more academically interesting if they weren't dying. Their crystalline skin seemed to shift colors slightly in the changing light, and their body structure suggested they came from a world with different gravity and atmospheric conditions. But most importantly, they were small, fragile, and their shallow breathing was getting shallower by the minute. Wade knelt down beside them, careful not to make sudden movements. Up close, he could see that their crystalline features weren't just aesthetic. Their skin actually seemed to be some kind of living crystal matrix, which probably meant they had very specific temperature requirements that were nothing like human tolerances. "Well, aren't you 3 just full of biological surprises?" he said quietly. One of the cubs stirred slightly at the sound of his voice, but didn't wake. Their breathing was so faint it was barely visible. Wade's engineering mind was already working through the problem. Heat source, failing station power, plus his transport's salvageable power cells. Insulation, whatever he could jury-rig from available materials. Shelter integrity, questionable at best, catastrophic at worst. The math was not in their favor. But Wade had learned a long time ago that impossible situations just meant you had to be more creative with your solutions. He'd once kept an entire refugee camp warm using nothing but solar panels and a collection of mirrors salvaged from a shopping mall. This was just another puzzle, albeit one with much higher stakes and much less margin for error. First step: inventory everything useful. Wade spent the next hour cataloging every piece of equipment, every tool, every scrap of material that might be repurposed. The research station was well equipped, but equipped for science, not survival. Still, there were heating elements in some of the lab equipment, insulation materials in the walls, and enough electronic components to build a small city's worth of jury-rigged devices. The transport wreckage outside was another matter entirely. Getting to it meant venturing back into the blizzard, but his transport's power cells were military-grade, designed to function in extreme conditions and provide emergency power for extended periods. If he could salvage them, he might be able to buy enough time to build something more permanent. "This is either going to be brilliant or spectacularly fatal," Wade announced to his unconscious audience as he suited up for another trip into the meteorological nightmare outside. "Given my track record, probably both." The trip to the transport was a nightmare of wind, snow, and cold that seemed personally invested in killing him. Wade had to rope himself to the station and follow the line back, because visibility was roughly equivalent to being inside a milk bottle during an earthquake. But he managed to salvage 2 power cells, a heating unit, and several meters of thermal insulation before the cold started affecting his suit's systems. Back inside the station, Wade began the delicate process of turning a research laboratory into a survival shelter. The heating unit from his transport was designed to warm a much smaller space, but with proper insulation and air circulation, it might be enough. The trick was creating a microenvironment within the larger, failing station. Using emergency thermal blankets, salvaged insulation, and a liberal application of military-grade adhesive tape, Wade began constructing what he privately thought of as the most expensive blanket fort in galactic history. The research station's furniture became the frame, the salvaged materials became the walls, and desperation became the driving force behind increasingly creative engineering solutions. The power cells went to work running the heating unit, while Wade rigged a circulation system using fans salvaged from laboratory equipment. It wasn't pretty, and it definitely wouldn't pass any safety inspections, but it was starting to generate actual warmth. The cubs responded almost immediately to the rising temperature. Their breathing deepened slightly, and the crystalline patterns in their skin began to show more color variation. Whatever their biology required, heat was definitely part of it. But Wade's improvised shelter had problems. The insulation was better than nothing, but it wasn't designed for this kind of extreme cold. Heat leaked through gaps in his construction, and the power cells, while impressive, weren't infinite. At current consumption rates, he had maybe 6 hours before everything shut down. 6 hours to ride out a blizzard that could last for days. Wade stared at his handiwork, a cocoon of thermal blankets and salvaged equipment surrounding 3 alien cubs in the middle of a failing research station, and laughed. It wasn't a particularly sane laugh, but then again, the situation wasn't particularly sane either. "You know," he said to the cubs, who were still unconscious, but at least now unconscious in relative warmth, 20 years ago, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was running out of coffee during a disaster relief operation. Funny how perspective changes." The heating system hummed quietly, a sound that was both comforting and ominous. Comforting because it meant warmth and life, ominous because it meant power consumption and finite resources. Wade settled down to monitor his improvised life support system and plan his next moves. The shelter was working for now, but for now wasn't going to cut it. He needed better insulation, more efficient heating, and some kind of backup plan for when his current setup inevitably failed. Looking at the cubs, Wade felt something he hadn't experienced in years of disaster relief work. Personal investment that went beyond professional obligation. These weren't colonists he'd been sent to rescue or disaster victims he'd been assigned to help. These were three small, vulnerable beings he'd chosen to save, and that choice had somehow made all the difference. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the station with undiminished fury. The wind howled, the building shook, and somewhere in the distance, Wade could hear the sounds of structural failure as other parts of the facility surrendered to the storm. But inside his improvised shelter, three alien cubs breathed steadily in artificial warmth, and a human engineer settled down to solve the next impossible problem in a career full of them. "Okay, universe," Wade said quietly, checking power levels and adjusting heating controls. "You want to play hardball? Let's play hardball." The cubs slept on, unaware that their survival now depended on one stubborn human's refusal to accept that some problems were unsolvable. But Wade had built a career on proving that impossible was just another word for hasn't been done yet. And he wasn't about to stop now. Wade was in the middle of reconfiguring the heating circulation system when the first cub opened its eyes. Not opened them in the traditional sense, mind you. What happened was more like watching a sunrise through crystal. The cub's facial features simply began to glow, with a soft internal light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with its breathing. Wade froze, his hands still wrapped around a section of improvised ductwork, and stared. In 20 years of disaster relief work, he'd seen a lot of species wake up from trauma-induced unconsciousness. Usually, it involved groaning, confusion, and at least some amount of panic. This was different. The cub's crystalline features brightened gradually, like a lamp being slowly turned up, and then those glowing eyes, if they were eyes, fixed on Wade with an intensity that made him suddenly very aware that he knew absolutely nothing about this species' threat assessment capabilities. "Well, hello there," Wade said carefully, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm Wade. I'm trying to keep you and your friends from becoming ice sculptures. Please don't eat me." The cub's response was unexpected. Images flooded Wade's mind. Not his own thoughts, but something else. Pictures, emotions, concepts that arrived in his brain without any input from his actual senses. For a moment, the disorientation was so complete that he nearly fell over. The images were fragmented but clear. The research station, as it had been before, full of activity and light. Beings in environmental suits working with equipment. Then darkness, panic, the sensation of being hidden in this room while something terrible happened outside. Fear, cold, and the gradual dimming of consciousness as the temperature dropped. Wade blinked hard, shaking his head to clear the alien thoughts from his mind. "Okay," he said slowly. "So you're telepathic. That's actually really useful for this conversation, isn't it?" The cub, Wade decided to think of this one as bright, because of the way its features glowed, seemed to be studying him with the same intensity he was studying it. More images came, but gentler this time, as if Bright was learning to modulate the telepathic transmission. These images were questions, Wade realized. Who was he? Why was he here? What had happened to the others? "The others?" Wade asked aloud. "You mean there were other people here?" The response was a wave of sadness so profound that Wade actually gasped. Images of adult beings with the same crystalline features but larger, more developed. Bright's parents, Wade understood without being told, and something had happened to them. The second cub began to wake, its features lighting up with a cooler blue-white radiance. This one Wade mentally labeled cool, because apparently his brain had decided to use the most obvious naming convention possible. Cool's awakening brought new images, clearer memories of what had happened at the research station. Human soldiers in colonial uniforms, weapons, the adult crystalline beings trying to protect their young. A desperate plan to hide the cubs in the laboratory while the adults faced whatever threat had come to the station. "Oh," Wade said quietly, the pieces falling into place with horrifying clarity. "Oh, hell." The third cub woke as Wade was processing the implications of what he'd seen. This one glowed with a warm golden light, earning the mental designation warm. And warm brought the final piece of the puzzle. The adult beings, Bright, Cool, and Warm's parents, hadn't just been research subjects. They'd been researchers. This had been their station, their work, their home. Until a colonial military unit had arrived with orders that apparently didn't include taking prisoners. Wade sat back on his heels, staring at the three cubs who were now all regarding him with those unsettling, luminous gazes. The terrible irony of the situation hit him like a physical blow. "So let me get this straight," he said, more to himself than to the cubs. "Your parents were killed by humans. Your home was destroyed by humans. And now you're dependent on a human to keep you alive." The emotional response from all three cubs was complex. Fear, uncertainty, but also something that might have been gratitude. They understood what he was doing for them, even if they didn't understand why. Wade's suit computer chose that moment to remind him of more immediate concerns with a soft chime. Power levels were dropping faster than anticipated. His improvised heating system was working, but it was also consuming energy at an unsustainable rate. "We've got bigger problems than interspecies politics," Wade announced, checking the readouts on his power cells. "At current consumption, we've got maybe 3 hours of heat left. After that, we're all going to find out what it's like to be ice sculptures." The cubs' glow dimmed noticeably at that news. Apparently, they understood enough of his language, or were picking up enough of his thoughts, to grasp the situation. Bright projected a new image. The research station, as it had been, with its full power grid operational and heating systems running normally. Then, an image of the current reality: failing systems, damaged infrastructure, and rapidly depleting energy reserves. "Yeah, I know," Wade said. "Believe me, if I could just flip a switch and get this place running again, we wouldn't be having this conversation." But even as he said it, Wade's engineer brain was working on the problem. The station's main power grid was down, but the infrastructure was still there. If he could find a way to restore even partial power, he might be able to run the heating systems more efficiently than his jury-rigged setup. Cool projected an image that made Wade pause. It was a schematic of some kind, technical diagrams that showed the station's power distribution system. But how could Cool know about? The answer came in another wave of images. The cubs' parents hadn't just been conducting research here. They'd been studying human technology, trying to understand how colonial equipment worked. The cubs had absorbed that knowledge through whatever telepathic connection they'd shared with their parents. "You know how this station works," Wade realized. "You actually know how to fix it." The response was immediate and complex. Yes, they understood the systems, but they were too small, too weak, too young to actually manipulate the equipment. Their parents had been the ones with the physical capability to implement what they learned. But Wade had the physical capability. And now, thanks to their telepathic abilities, he had access to their technical knowledge. It was, Wade reflected, probably the most unusual engineering collaboration in galactic history. A human disaster relief specialist and 3 alien cubs working together to repair a research station in the middle of a blizzard that was trying to kill them all. "All right then," Wade said, standing up and checking his equipment. "Let's go fix a power grid." The cubs couldn't physically accompany him. They were still too weak and too dependent on the warmth of the improvised shelter. But as Wade prepared to leave their sanctuary and venture into the colder parts of the station, he found himself carrying something new. Alien knowledge transmitted directly into his mind. It was disorienting, having information that wasn't his own floating around in his head. But it was also incredibly precise. He knew exactly which power relays needed to be reset, which circuits needed to be bypassed, and which backup systems could be safely overloaded to restore partial heating to the station. The work took 2 hours of crawling through maintenance shafts, rewiring control panels, and manually resetting systems that had been damaged in whatever conflict had claimed the cubs' parents. Wade's hands were numb with cold by the time he finished, despite his suit's heating elements. But when he activated the restored power grid, the station's heating systems came online with a steady hum that was the most beautiful sound he'd heard in years. The cubs' excited glow was visible even from the corridor outside the laboratory. Wade returned to find them more active than he'd seen them since their initial awakening, their crystalline features bright with what could only be described as joy. "Not bad for an interspecies engineering team," Wade said, settling down to check on his improvised shelter. The restored station heating meant his power cells could focus on maintaining the localized warm zone around the cubs rather than fighting the entire building's heat loss. But as he watched the cubs' animated telepathic conversation, a light show of changing colors and pulsing brightness, Wade realized they weren't just celebrating the restored heating. They were planning something. And judging by the images that occasionally leaked into his awareness, it involved the blizzard outside, the station's communication systems, and something that felt distinctly like hope. "What are you 3 up to?" Wade asked. The answer, when it came, was both simple and terrifying. The cubs hadn't just been hiding in this station. They'd been waiting. And now that they were warm and safe and had a human ally, they were ready to do what they'd been preparing for all along. They were going to call for help. The only question was whether that help would arrive in time, and whether it would consider Wade a savior or another threat to be eliminated. The blizzard's final assault on the research station began at hour 18 of Wade's impromptu babysitting assignment, and it came with all the subtlety of a freight train driven by someone having a very bad day. Wade was monitoring the power distribution systems when the first structural support beam gave way with a sound like the universe cracking a knuckle. The entire station shuddered, emergency lights flickered, and somewhere in the building's depths, something expensive-sounding exploded. "Well," Wade said, watching his carefully balanced power readings go completely haywire, "that's not ideal." The cub's telepathic response was immediate and alarmed. A flood of images showing the station's structural integrity failing in real time. Through their inherited knowledge of the building's systems, they could sense damage that Wade's instruments couldn't even detect yet. And what they were sensing was catastrophic. The blizzard had shifted direction, hitting the station from an angle it wasn't designed to handle. Support structures were failing in sequence, like dominoes falling in slow motion. They had minutes, maybe less, before the entire laboratory section, their sanctuary, collapsed under the combined weight of structural failure and accumulated snow. Wade's engineering mind went into overdrive, calculating load distributions, structural integrity, and evacuation options. The math was unforgiving. Even if they could somehow get to another part of the station, there was no guarantee that section would be any more stable. And moving the Cubs in their weakened state, in sub-zero temperatures, would probably kill them anyway. "Okay," Wade said aloud, his voice steady despite the fact that Death was apparently scheduling a house call. "New plan. We're not running from this building. We're making sure this building doesn't fall on us." The Cubs projected confusion and fear, but also something else: trust. Despite everything, despite the fact that his species had killed their parents, despite the impossibility of their situation, they trusted him to find a solution. Wade wished he shared their confidence. He started with the immediate crisis. Using the Cubs' telepathic knowledge of the station's structure, Wade identified the critical support points that were keeping their section of the building intact. Then he began the delicate process of redistributing load and reinforcing weak points using everything he could salvage. Furniture became improvised supports. Equipment racks were repositioned to bear weight they were never designed to handle. Wade even cannibalized parts of his own improvised shelter, sacrificing warmth for structural integrity. But it wasn't enough. Even as he worked, he could feel the building settling around them, slowly surrendering to forces that were simply too great to resist. The Cubs were growing weaker. The constant telepathic monitoring of the station's condition was draining them. And despite the restored heating, their crystalline biology was struggling with the stress and cold. Their internal glow was dimming, their responses to Wade's thoughts becoming slower and less focused. Wade was recalculating support loads for the third time when Bright projected something that made him stop cold. It wasn't an image this time, but a concept. A possibility that Wade's human mind hadn't even considered. The Cubs could do more than just share knowledge telepathically. Working together, they could manipulate electromagnetic fields, influence electrical systems, even affect the molecular structure of certain materials. It was how their parents had been able to interface so effectively with human technology, not through understanding alone, but through direct manipulation at the quantum level. But using those abilities would require energy they didn't have, in ways their young bodies weren't fully developed to handle. It might save the building, but it would almost certainly kill them. "No," Wade said firmly. "Absolutely not. We're not trading your lives for a few more hours in a collapsing building." The Cubs' response was patient but determined. Images of their parents, of the sacrifice they'd made to hide their children, images of Wade himself, working tirelessly to keep them alive despite having every reason to abandon them. This was their choice, they seemed to say, their way of contributing to their own survival. Wade wanted to argue, but another support beam chose that moment to fail, and suddenly arguing seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. "If we do this," he said, "we do it smart. No heroic sacrifices, no dramatic gestures. We stabilize this building just enough to ride out the storm, and then we figure out how to get you three the help you need." The Cubs' agreement was immediate and unified, a single pulse of warm light that somehow conveyed both determination and gratitude. What followed was the most surreal engineering project of Wade's career. Using his hands and tools to manipulate physical structures, while three alien Cubs used their telepathic abilities to strengthen molecular bonds, adjust electromagnetic fields, and somehow convince the laws of physics to be just a little more flexible than usual. Wade couldn't see what they were doing. Their abilities operated on levels his human senses couldn't detect. But he could feel the results. Metal that should have been brittle with cold became more resilient. Joints that should have failed under stress held firm. The building stopped its gradual collapse and settled into an uneasy but stable equilibrium. The effort left the Cubs exhausted. Their internal glow dimmed to barely visible flickers, and their telepathic communications became weak and intermittent. But they were alive. The building was stable, and outside, the blizzard was finally beginning to lose its fury. Wade wrapped the cubs in every piece of insulation he could find and settled down to wait. His power cells were nearly depleted. The heating system was running on backup power that wouldn't last much longer, and he was so tired he could barely think straight. But they were alive. All of them. It was during those quiet hours, as the storm gradually weakened and the cubs slept in exhausted safety, that Wade heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the wind or the settling building or his struggling heating system. Engines. Multiple engines, growing louder. Wade's first thought was rescue. His second thought was significantly less optimistic. If colonial forces had been responsible for what happened to the cubs' parents, then human rescuers might not be rescuers at all. The cubs woke as the engine sounds grew closer, their features brightening with alert wariness. Through the telepathic link they still maintained, Wade could sense their fear and uncertainty. "It's okay," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure it was. "Whatever happens, we face it together." The engines cut off somewhere outside the station, and Wade could hear the sounds of landing procedures, equipment being deployed, and voices shouting orders in multiple languages. Some of those languages, he realized, weren't human. When the airlock cycled and the first figures appeared in the laboratory doorway, Wade found himself facing a mixed group of beings he'd never seen before. They were tall, elegant, with the same crystalline features as the cubs, but fully developed and radiating an authority that was unmistakable. Adults of the cubs' species. And they did not look happy. The largest of the newcomers stepped forward, its features blazing with what Wade was pretty sure was anger. It spoke in a language that sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane, but the cubs responded immediately with a burst of telepathic communication that was so intense Wade could feel it as pressure behind his eyes. What followed was the most one-sided conversation of Wade's life. The adult beings exchanged rapid telepathic communications with the cubs, while Wade stood there feeling like the only person at a party who didn't speak the language. But gradually, the newcomers' aggressive postures began to change. The blazing anger in their features shifted to something more complex: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been grudging respect. One of the adults approached Wade directly, and when it spoke, the words formed directly in his mind, rather than coming through his ears. "You are the human who preserved our young." It wasn't a question, but Wade answered anyway. "Yes, I couldn't just leave them to die. Despite knowing that your species killed their parents, despite having no obligation to them, despite the risk to your own survival." Wade shrugged. "Sometimes you do the right thing because it's the right thing, not because it's easy or safe or makes sense." The adult's features shifted through a spectrum of colors Wade couldn't interpret, but when it spoke again, there was something different in its mental voice. "The young ones have shared their memories with us. Your efforts to preserve them, your willingness to sacrifice your safety for theirs, your collaboration in maintaining this structure during the storm. We all worked together," Wade said. "I couldn't have done it without them." Another exchange of telepathic communication, this one involving all the adults and cubs. Wade caught fragments of it, images of his improvised shelter, his repair of the power systems, his refusal to abandon them when the building began to collapse. "We came here expecting to find our children dead, and their killer waiting to be captured," the adult said finally. "Instead, we find them alive, and their protector exhausted from preserving their lives." "I'm not their protector," Wade said. I'm just a guy who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. You diminish yourself, human Wade. What you have done. It requires a word in your language that we had not believed applied to your species. Wade waited. Honor. You have acted with honor toward beings who had no claim on your loyalty, no way to reward your sacrifice, no ability to ensure your survival in return. This is not behavior we have observed in your species before. Wade thought about that for a moment, about colonial policies, about the fear and prejudice that drove species apart, about the thousand small ways that different beings failed to understand each other. Maybe you just hadn't met the right humans yet, he said finally. The adult's laugh was like crystal chimes in sunlight. Perhaps, or perhaps we had not given your species the opportunity to show us who they truly are. The rescue that followed was efficient and careful. The adults had medical equipment specifically designed for their young heating systems that worked better than anything Wade could have improvised, and transportation that could handle the weather conditions that had stranded him in the first place. But before they left the Po research station, the adult who had spoken to Wade approached him one final time. We will remember this, human Wade. What you did here. What you chose when you could have chosen differently. It will be remembered, and it will be shared. And perhaps it will change how our peoples see each other. Wade looked at the three cubs, now warm and safe and glowing brightly with recovered health. They projected a final image to him, not words or concepts, but pure emotion. Gratitude, affection, and the kind of trust that crossed species boundaries. Take care of yourselves, Wade said, and maybe next time we meet, it'll be under better circumstances. The cubs' response was immediate and unanimous. There would definitely be a next time. Wade watched them leave, three small figures surrounded by the protective presence of their people, and found himself reflecting on the strange turns his life had taken. He'd started the day as a simple supply runner, and somehow ended up as an interspecies diplomat with a reputation he'd never asked for. The adult who had spoken to him earlier approached one final time, carrying something in its crystalline hands. It was a small device, no bigger than Wade's palm, that seemed to pulse with the same internal light as the cubs. This is a communication beacon, the being said, its mental voice warm with what Wade was learning to recognize as their species' version of affection. It will allow you to contact us, should you ever have need. More importantly, it will allow our young ones to speak with you as they grow. Wade accepted the device, surprised by its warmth and the faint tingling sensation it produced against his skin. They want to stay in touch? The response came not from the adult, but from the cubs themselves. A burst of telepathic communication so joyful and enthusiastic that Wade actually laughed out loud. The message was clear. They considered him family now, and family didn't just disappear. They have named you Keeper of Warmth in our language, the adult explained. It is a title of great honor among our people. You will always be welcome in our space, Wade of the humans. As the rescue ships prepared to depart, Wade found himself surrounded by a strange sense of completion. Not ending, exactly, but the feeling that something important had shifted in the universe. The blizzard was over. The cubs were safe. And somewhere in the complex web of interspecies politics, a tiny crack had appeared in the wall of mistrust and fear. The ships lifted off into the clearing sky, their engines warming the air with ionized exhaust. Wade stood in the entrance of the damaged research station, still holding the communication beacon, and watched until they disappeared into the stars. It wasn't until they were gone that he realized he still had his own rescue to arrange. His transport was still buried in a snowbank, his emergency beacon was still malfunctioning, and he was still stranded on a planet that seemed determined to kill anything foolish enough to visit. But somehow, Wade found he wasn't worried about it. He'd survived the impossible once already today. Getting himself off Arcturus Prime seemed almost mundane by comparison. Besides, he had a feeling his new friends wouldn't let him stay stranded for long. Wade tucked the beacon safely into his emergency pack and started back toward his crashed transport. There was work to do, repairs to make, and probably several dozen incident reports to file once he got back to base. But for the first time in years, Wade was looking forward to writing those reports. After all, how often did you get to document the day you helped save 3 alien cubs and accidentally started a diplomatic revolution? The universe, he decided, definitely had a sense of humor. And sometimes, just sometimes, the punchline was actually worth the setup.